Welcome to another edition of George Washington Speaks. I'm Tom Saffold. 7 difficult months went by before the trial of the soldiers came to court. A young and proven colonial lawyer took their case to make sure justice was done, and he got them off, mostly. A surprise witness was instrumental in the jury's decision. Both will be revealed in the Boston Massacre trial edition of George Washington Speaks.
Today we're going to talk about the trial. It took several months to fulfill Governor Hutchinson's promise of a proper trial and to bring Captain Preston and the other soldiers to trial. Because Boston was a hotbed of patriotic fervor, it was exceedingly difficult to find a Boston lawyer who would be willing to put his reputation on the line and his business at risk in representing the British soldiers. However, John Adams, a cousin of Firebrand Sam Adams, joined with Josiah Quincy to represent the soldiers and to argue their case. They were firmly convinced that the British soldiers deserved a fair day in court, especially since the penalty for their conviction would be death by hanging. Since Adams was sure that impartial jurors could not be found in Boston, the first thing he did was to convince the judge to seat a jury of non-Bostonians. Given that Captain Preston was the commander of the detachment and an officer, his trial came to court first in October 1770. Adams asserted that the captain and his soldiers had acted in self-defense. He portrayed the mob as a motley rabble of saucy employees that had besieged the redcoats, and for their own self-defense, they had forced the soldiers to react with deadly force. Further, Adams argued that confusion that night was rampant and that the majority of Bostonian eyewitness accounts significantly contradicted each other, and the more credible testimony from other witnesses. This was especially pertinent in establishing whether or not Captain Preston had ordered his men to fire on the colonists. On that pivotal charge, a turning point most likely came when Adams examined Richard Palms. He was able to elicit from him that Captain Preston had voiced his intention to hold his fire in the moments before Private Montgomery was struck by debris. And further, that he, Palms, was actually in the most advantageous place to clearly observe Captain Preston's words and actions. Palms testified that Captain Preston did not stand alone between his soldiers and the crowd, but that he, Richard Palms, stood beside him. And after the gun went off, he, Palms, then heard the word fire. In his closing remarks to the court, Adams admitted that he did not know who gave the word to fire, but as a result of Richard Palms' testimony, that a reasonable doubt existed that it was not Captain Preston. He ended by observing that facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. The trial of the 8 soldiers followed a similar path, but focused on sorting out the testimony as to what the crowd actions were and whether the soldiers' reactions were appropriate. Perhaps one of the biggest factors that influenced the verdict of the jury was the testimony of one Patrick Carr. Patrick Carr was shot by the soldiers and laid between life and death for 2 weeks before succumbing. Since the trial started 8 months after his death, the judges allowed the deathbed testimony heard by his surgeon to be read as evidence. Rather than summarize it for you, I thought it best to let you hear the court transcript for yourselves. Justices Edmund Trowbridge and Peter Oliver gave their instructions to the jury. Moreover, Judge Oliver specifically addressed Carr's testimony in this way. This Carr was not upon oath, it is true, but you will determine whether a man just stepping into eternity is not to be believed, especially in favor of a set of men by whom he had lost his life. The surgeon, John Jeffries, testified as follows. The question was, "Were you Patrick Carr's surgeon?" "I was." "Was he, Carr, apprehensive of his danger?" "Yes. He told me he was a native of Ireland, that he had frequently seen mobs and soldiers called upon to quell them. He had seen soldiers often fire on the people in Ireland, but he had never seen them bear half so much before they fired in his life." Question: when had you the last conversation with him? About 4 o'clock in the afternoon preceding the night in which he died, and he then particularly said, "He forgave the man, whoever he was that shot him. He was satisfied he had no malice, but fired to defend himself." Which brings us to the jury. The jury deliberated 2.5 hours and found Preston not guilty. Later on, at the end of the second trial, the trial of the soldiers, the jury found that 6 of the soldiers were not guilty due to self-defense, while Privates Hugh Montgomery and Matthew Kilroy, who shot directly into the crowd, were convicted of manslaughter. And they both were punished by being branded on the hand with a hot iron. Many years later, Adams recollected that his defense was one of the best pieces of service I have rendered to my country. He acknowledged that the foundation of American independence was laid the night the shots rang out in Boston. Adams also recollected that although the verdict of the jury was exactly right concerning the events of the night, it did not absolve those who caused the soldiers to be there in the first place, referring to the Parliament and the King. Captain Preston said about the conflict, "None of them, the mob, was a hero. The victims were troublemakers who got more than they deserved. The soldiers were professionals who shouldn't have panicked. The whole thing shouldn't have happened." I believe that this incident is one of the most significant events that turned colonial sentiment against King George III and the British parliamentary authority. And once again, I might ask you, listeners, if you were a patriot or a loyalist or a British redcoat or a patriot, what might you think about the trial and the verdict?
The Boston Massacre and trial sharpened the divisions between loyalists and patriots in the colonies, but it also got the attention of Britain and brought about the repeal of several laws and taxes that the colonists objected to. However, the Tea Act remained in place. George Washington will explain why the Tea Act was kept and how the colonists responded in the next episode. Please join us for the next edition